We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion: to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc.
Pointe du Hoc was the highest promontory in between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, and it had to be neutralized because the Allied air reconnaissance had seen that there were heavy artillery up there. In fact, there was 6 captured former French Grand Puissant Filot long guns, or 155 guns.
Now, initially, these guns, part of the West Wall defense, were not covered. They weren't in casemates. They were just out in the open, and they could be used to attack Allied shipping, or they could be used to help repel a landing. Obviously, these guns, which would range down certainly on Utah Beach, needed to be neutralized in order for the invasion to be successful.
When the battery was originally built, it was at a time when Allied air power was not threatening targets in occupied France. As 1942 gave way to 1943, that began to change. And with the sudden appearance of Allied bombers, Pointe du Hoc was recognized as being very vulnerable. The site was bombed several times, leading climactically to a bombing raid in April 1944, just weeks before the invasion, that produced the heavily cratered environment that you see here today. And then in that bombing raid, the bombs damaged these concrete tables. They damaged them to such a degree that the 155mm guns that were still here at the time could really no longer be used effectively. So the Germans removed the guns, they moved them 1,200 yards into the interior, and replaced them with pieces of timber covered by camouflage nets. To photo reconnaissance aircraft, it appeared that the battery might still be armed, but we just didn't know for sure.
When the Germans moved the weapons that were up at the point, they didn't move them far, only 1,200 meters into the interior, just to the south side of the D514 coast road, the road that runs from Grand-Comte-Mézy down to Vierville-sur-Mer. They emplaced those guns then along a hedgerow line facing toward Utah Beach to where they could have been used on D-Day. But the Rangers landed, moved into the battery site where they found no guns present. The Rangers then moved on to their secondary mission, which was to establish a roadblock on the D514 coast road. And while they were establishing that roadblock, the first sergeant from D Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a man named Len Lamel, observed heavy tire ruts in a hedgerow enclosed path.
Lamel then followed those tire tracks, and they led him all the way down that hedgerow to the spot where he found all 5 of the German captured French GPFs. Lamel then used the thermite grenade to disable the first gun. with another ranger named Jack Kuhn. They disabled the second. Then the two of them went back, retrieved more thermite grenades, returned to the site where the guns were, disabled the rest of them. Lamel then took the further step of dismounting the sighting system from each gun. He then wrapped his M41 field jacket around them, and using the buttstock of his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, he then crushed all the sights. So it was just back there that the Ranger mission was accomplished on D-Day. It wasn't accomplished in the way that they had expected it, but those guns were disabled by Len Lamel and Jack Kuhn, and those guns never fired a shot on June 6th. It's well known that during the Normandy invasion, certain American airborne units were scattered. There were sticks of paratroopers that landed a mile, 2 or 3 miles off of their drop zone, but then there was the worst case scenario. The worst example was near here. This is the village of Glen near Carentan, south of Carentan, 16 miles south of the 82nd Airborne Division drop zone area. And in the marshy flatlands just immediately to the west of this village, there were a series of aircraft that dropped over 150 men from the Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. In addition to them, there were men from B Company of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. For the 507th paratroopers that landed here near the village of Glen, they were 16 miles south of their drop zone. They were so far off of the drop zone that when they figured out where they were, their commanding officer, Major Charles Johnston, chose to keep them here rather than trying to fight their way toward the 507th drop zone because it was too far away. And so they fortified this hilltop, set up a perimeter, and they decided that they would await a link up from forces advancing from the Allied beachhead.
The Americans formed a defensive perimeter. They had a patrol down the hill, set up in an ambush position, and on June 10th, they had somebody to ambush. It was a reconnaissance element of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. They ambushed them, they killed 4 Germans, and drove them off. The problem was the Germans knew they were there, and at this time, they were still far behind enemy lines. So oddly enough, not all of the men that were at Grange were from the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment. There were men from the 501st, and those are the guys who actually ambushed the German reconnaissance unit. But there's also an Australian there, a man by the name of Stanley K. Black, and he was in the Royal Australian Air Force. He'd been shot down over Caen, and the French, hearing that there were Americans at Grange, brought Stanley K. Black there. He ended up picking up an M1 rifle and actively participated in the battle.
On Sunday, June 11, 1944, elements of the 38th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 17th SS carried out 3 successive attacks against this hilltop. And it was during the shelling prior to that 3rd attack that American paratroopers and French civilians were killed. Their names are remembered on the plaque that's behind me. The Germans then, in a final attack, overran the hilltop. We believe it was then that Flight Sergeant Black was killed in action, fighting alongside his American brothers. It was here in the church that there was an aid station, and that aid station was being run by Captain Abraham Sofian. Sofian was the battalion surgeon for the 3rd Battalion, 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was here with 2 medics and 21 wounded. And when the Germans overran the hilltop, they took them, carried the enlisted men to the village of Ménilongo, just a mile to the south, where they executed them all. They captured 3 officers, Major Johnston, Captain Sofian, and then another 507th officer. They killed them as well. The 2 parish priests that were here, Father Albert Le Blastier and Father Charles Le Barbenchon, they were also murdered by the Germans, and their bodies rest here in the center of this memorial. And so the names on the wall behind me were people who were collateral damage in combat during the Battle of June 11, 1944. But some of those names, to include the names of the 2 parish priests, were people that were killed in a war crime, retribution for what had happened here during the day in 3 successive attacks on June 11th.